Okay, we're going to continue on with our Q&A on proposals for the church's future. I would like to introduce my colleague, Sam Hodgers from News, who will be the moderator for this panel.
Hey, good afternoon. We tried to get Chief Justice John Roberts to moderate, but he couldn't make it, so you got me instead. I am looking forward to this. I've tried to become an expert on all these plans. I had big plans to become an expert on all these plans, but I haven't gotten there yet, so I'm grateful for this opportunity to have us ask questions, detailed questions about the possibilities for the future of the church, and grateful for the people behind me. So we have Reverend Jay Williams, who will speak about the Forward proposal. We have Reverend Kent Millard, who will speak about the Indianapolis plan. Reverend Kenitha Biggins-Sai, who will speak about the regional conference concept. And then Reverend Junius Dotson, who will speak to the protocol for grace and reconciliation through separation. So this is very much question and answer. This is your chance to ask questions, and we do want them to be questions. Am I messing up? I'm sorry. Lonnie Chafin. I'm sorry, Lonnie. I'm sorry. And we have Lonnie Chafin, who will represent Next and speak about their proposal as well. So it's Q&A, so if you have questions, please advance to the microphone, and we will ask that they be questions and not speeches, and that they be concise. That would be great. So let's begin here. Question, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Lonnie Brooks, Lay, Alaska. Question for Kent Millard and Darren Cushman-Wood, either or both. What barriers would you see to proceeding by way of a motion in the Legislative Committee on Conferences to substitute the Feinberg Protocol for the Indianapolis Plan, rather than having one or more annual conferences hold special sessions to introduce the Feinberg Protocol's legislation as a separate action?
Thank you, Lonnie. I think that's a very good question, because the challenge now is that all legislation was supposed to be submitted by September 18th, so the protocol is coming in after that. But there is a provision in the discipline that an annual conference can submit legislation, I think, up through the middle of March. And so the idea is, I understand for the protocol, is to have an annual conference or more submit the legislation. If that does not happen, the Indianapolis plan folks would be glad to allow the protocol to become a substitute to the Indianapolis plan. So the Indianapolis plan already has the legislation, it's already submitted, and one way of getting the protocol on the table is to substitute it for something else. And so we would be willing to do that because we're working for the passing of the protocol now, because it contains so much of the Indianapolis plan, and it reaches some of the same goals that we were trying to reach. And in fact, it did it somewhat better because they worked out the finances, which we didn't get done. But there are parts of the Indianapolis plan that I think could be helpful. Been a lot of talk about finances, and one of the provisions of the Indianapolis plan is that we would ask for continuing funding for central conferences until 2024 during that quadrennium by all the denominations. Now, it can't be required, I suppose, if we've separated, but we think that we all need to keep supporting our central conferences like we have in the past and not leaving them in limbo in this time of change.
Very good. Question here.
Yes, hi. My question is whether or not any of the plans that have been proposed will incorporate the global social principles that have been developed and are being presented this time around. And I'd particularly like to hear from the Next folks as to whether or not they envision that being included.
Thanks for the question, Tom. Yes, we heartily support the changes in the global social principles. We are encouraged that the Central Conferences were so engaged in writing them, and really think the revisions on marriage in the social principles are something we can support.
Others who would like to speak to that? Global social principles?
I will. Kenitha Bigumsai, Connectional Table. And again, I want to say another shout out for the Global Social Principles, largely because of the process that they engage. As you know, the Board of Church and Society engaged years-long processes that engaged folks from the Central Conferences. And in a church that often functions in a way that is very U.S.-centric, that was forward-thinking and I believe prophetic to really hear the voices of the Central Conference folks. And if you look at the global social principles, you'll see that the harmful language is removed. You'll also see what I thought was an excellent statement on polygamy in the marriage section. And from the interactions that I've had with Central Conference delegates over the years, I could hear their voices in that statement. So I think in terms of process, that is important for us to support. I think it's especially important for us to support the leadership of our brothers and sisters, our siblings from the Central Conferences.
I would add, Sam. Sam?
Yes.
Here, behind you.
Oh,
Yes.
okay, I'm sorry.
I just want to add that, the New Expressions Worldwide Plan calls for an opportunity for the 4 different denominations to be in some type of covenant together, even full communion, and the global social principles might just be that, part of that baseline of what communion and covenant among the 4 individual denominations would be.
Thank you. Here.
Dawn Taylor Storm, Eastern Pennsylvania. Questions for Dr. Dotson. If an annual conference votes out of the UMC, do conference assets automatically transfer out of the UMC upon the date of the vote, or is there a transitional time for realignment, knowing human lives are impacted by these decisions? And related to that question, if a church has past liability to the annual conference from past due property liability health insurance, is the General Conference legally able to dismiss such liabilities, or will local churches who leave the denomination be required to meet these obligations to the annual conference before leaving? Easy questions. Thanks, Dr. Dotson.
Okay, could you stay at the microphone though, because that was a lot. So your first question is, would there be a time lag between the date that an actual annual conference actually votes? So my assumption is that there would be yes, that there would be some type of transition period. I don't think that's been truly clearly prescribed, though there is a date for annual conferences to vote. And then the second question was?
Can you clarify the timeline for us? Because I do think that part of legislation is very important for those of us who are making a decision on legislation we have not yet seen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So here are some timelines. So the registration of intent to form a new denomination, this would be like from leadership groups who were interested in forming a new denomination. That would be May 15th of 2021. Central Conferences may join a new denomination. That date is December 31st, 2021. Annual conferences, their date is July 1st, 2021. All right, and then, in conjunction or connection with that, then obviously if clergy were desiring to move to another denomination, they would have a date for them to declare their intention to do that. Okay, so I also want to be, I think what's important for us around the part of the mediation team, as we started talking about new denominations that we're forming, to kind of be very clear that as the United Methodist Church was continuing, that we still have processes that govern us and a book of discipline that governs us. And we were trying very intentionally not to govern other new denominations that were emerging. So new denominations that are emerging obviously will have their own processes. and will have their own ways of receiving people and those sort of things. So the protocol allows for that type of expression to happen.
Question here, please.
Yes. Junius, you can just stay up there. Paul Black from the Illinois Great Rivers Conference. My question is about the protocol. At the special session in 2019, in Decision 1377, the Judicial Council ruled that the threshold of a petition that advocated 55% failed the supermajority required in paragraph 41, which is part of the Constitution. My question is, how are the authors of the legislation addressing that issue without taking a constitutional amendment? And if the Judicial Council would void that part of the protocol, my question is, how fragile is this agreement, and can we hold it together?
Thank you for your question. First, let me say I am not a lawyer, but there are persons who are a part of the writing the actual legislation. So what's happening right now is that legislation is being written that will enact the protocol. And from my understanding, from the persons who are putting together this legislation, that issue will be addressed. And once the legislation is completely written, one of the things the protocol calls for is a Judicial Council review. So I'm certain that we'll be able to overcome that consideration.
I'm going to interject and see if our other panelists would, in kind of blitz fashion, talk about constitutionality and their plans and proposals. Lonnie, would you start?
The Next Generation Plan contemplates no constitutional changes except those in the connectional tables proposal.
And as I shared earlier, the connectional table proposal comes in two stages. The first stage is a U.S. regional committee and also a non-disciplinary petition that cares for the organization of that committee. That committee can begin to take legislative action to deal with U.S.-specific adaptable matters. It requires no constitutional amendments. However, the second stage, creating an actual U.S. as a regional conference, requires 2 amendments to the Constitution and 4 additions to the Constitution. What it is adding to the Constitution is this whole concept of a regional conference separate from a central conference, and then it is taking and dealing with the paragraphs that are actually detailing the organization, duties, and rights of a central conference and switching those over and adapting some of those for use within the U.S. as a regional conference. So there are some constitutional changes envisioned for stage 2 of creating a U.S. as a regional conference. That requires not only passage of the legislation, but ratification by annual conferences. Once that happens, we are envisioning having the U.S. as a regional conference in place by 2024. Now, the U.S. Regional Committee, of course, could be in place earlier than that.
One of the principles of the Indianapolis Committee was that nothing would require a constitutional amendment. So we all agreed that what we had to do had to be within the purview of legislation. And so everything in the Indianapolis plan is in the purview of legislation and does not require a constitutional amendment. And in fact, we designated it so anything, if the Indianapolis plan was passed, it would go in effect August 1st, 2020. So in a preliminary way, you start operating immediately that way in terms of the moratoriums, in terms of people making decisions about where they're going to be, where they're going to land denominationally. So it requires no constitutional amendments and has very quick implementation.
The new plan urgently moves towards liberation without haste. It identifies a process for a transparent transitional council that wouldn't bring legislation that would need to be under review because of potential unconstitutionality, having already figured out a plan behind closed doors in a way that then puts a product before the General Conference and says, you have to vote on it now. Rather, it says, let's identify a process to do the work out openly, in public, transparently, guided by a transitional council that would be duly elected by the General Conference in May.
Thank you. Question here.
Yes, my name is Reverend Dr. Thomas Hudspeth, and I am the president of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Ministries Committee, which is under Global Ministry, and I'm speaking through a sign language interpreter. I have a question for the panelists. From my understanding, there is 1 in 5 people with a disability. Has there been any input from people with disabilities in each of your proposals? And I'm sort of asking this with keeping in mind, for an example, like with the protocol, they had $39 million set aside for churches who have had historical experience with being oppressed. And that I feel would also include people with disabilities, also as well as the deaf and hard of hearing individuals and families, and hoping that that community is not excluded from all of this.
Who would like to address that?
Yeah, part of the approach of the new plan proposed by Ford is an intersectional approach that connects the sins of ableism to the sins of racism, to the sins of sexism, to the sins of heterosexism. So yes, in our work, most certainly there are folks that have disabilities, some that are visible, some that are not fully apparent, because our approach is to center those who are marginalized and often not incorporated into this work, and to do so in a very intentional way.
Yeah, I also want to say part of the work of the mediation team as we were thinking about all that was before us is how do we mitigate harm, further harm to anybody in the life of our denomination. And so I would say to you, part of my concern and desire to see the United Methodist Church continue, as well as dealing with $39 billion set aside for communities who have been historically marginalized by the sin of racism, was to begin to address some of that harm and to consider the impact that our proposals and separations would have on the future of the church. Another important consideration was having the Central Conference partners, conversation partners at the table. When we started thinking about separation, we started thinking about the impact of separation that would happen, not only, just really across our connection. It became really clear to us really quickly, number one, that we could not measure the impact. Number two, that there were things that we didn't even know, and couldn't even consider. And even as we began having these type of conversations, then more and more we would learn about new ministries, or ministries that would be harmed, and ministries that would be impacted if we did not do separation in a responsible and an orderly way. So I'd say all of those things kind of drove the process for us.
And
Okay.
can I just respond really
Absolutely.
quickly?
Sure.
And thank you for the question. The connectional table process involved members of the connectional table, members of the standing committee, and other bodies throughout the connection. One of the things that we don't think about in terms of being able to have more contextual governance within the U.S. is the ability to address some of our vitality issues, some of our issues around how do we reach out to all people in all communities. And so I appreciate your question, and just put a peg in that that is something that we need to think about. How do we begin to intersect and connect in ministry with all people? And I want to also just take a moment to just know that this is a moment to do this, and to thank our interpreters and Leo, who preaches. Thank you, Leo, and all of the others who are able to make this space more open and inclusive. And I think your question even was a call for us to think about that into the future. So thank you.
Okay, question here, please. Oh, I'm sorry,
Just
Lonnie.
one final
Okay,
thought.
all right.
Thank you for your question very much. I think we long to be a church that talks about ministry again. And so your question is what we hope to spend our time on at general conferences in the future. And I thank you very much for it. Our proposal would add to paragraph 140 the following language: acknowledging that the church has been divided for too long on the basis of perceived differences, we commit ourselves to the removal of every barrier that separates one from another in the body of Christ, including ableism, heterosexism, racism, sexism, misogyny, tribalism, and all other forms of xenophobia. By the power of Christ's redeeming and sanctifying love, we commit ourselves to grow in love and understanding until all of the walls that divide us are finally cast down.
Okay, any more? All right, next question here, please.
My name is Adrian Hill, lay delegate from Northern Illinois, honored to be among you. Queer UMC clergy and laypersons have stood by my side as the UMC has provided for me professionally and spiritually. So I would be a terrible ally if I didn't speak up in support of those many LGBTQIA+ persons who fellowshiped with me and uplifted me the past 10 years. Their harm is not relegated to just publicized UMC trials or complaints. In this state of Tennessee, where I was born and raised, legislation allows adoption agencies to deny same-sex couples the ability to adopt children in need of loving parents. This is harm. The UMC cannot say it stops harm with toothless cries for moratoriums and allowances for queer persons being told they cannot be ordained or be married in God's house. Liberationists have taught me that only bold and uncompromising affirmation stops harms, not plans that they believe leaves behind their siblings in hostile areas in order to prop up an institution that no longer listens to those crying out. So I ask, how do your plans protect our siblings globally in the entire UMC from the sin of homophobia and transphobia?
Who wants to go first?
I think you put your finger on the issue, that we are of very different minds about these issues. And that's why in the Indianapolis plan and the protocol, we think it's come time to separate for justice. That is, there will be a denomination of Methodists who are fully inclusive. If you stop and think about that, if there's a progressive or liberation denomination that's fully inclusive, it would be the only Methodist expression in the United States that fully accepts gay people. The other descendants of Wesley here, the AME Zion, CME, Nazarene, Salvation Army, none of those Methodist expressions accept gay people. These plans would provide a Methodist expression that's fully accepting and doing everything that you'd want to do, to have weddings in a sacred place, to affirm the adoption of gay people adopting children. All of those things would be accomplished by either the Indianapolis plan or the protocol by doing that.
Adrian, I don't know where Adrian went, but there he is. Adrian, thank you for your question. The connectional table does not prevent harm worldwide to LGBTQIA people. It does not. And that is something that I bemoan and that my heart aches over. I wish that there were a way to know that there would be no harm done anywhere. I remember when the Connectional Table put forth different kind of legislation some years back, and I first presented that legislation in Mozambique and met some people who were working on a burgeoning LGBTQIA justice movement within Mozambique, and the ways in which I cheered for them and yet said to myself, we cannot leave them behind. Our witness needs to shine around the world. So I hear your longing, and your longing is my longing. The CT proposal deals with a lot of things. It makes General Conference more efficient. It moves us away from a US-centric focus. It begins to open the door for us to do some things contextually within the United States. And hopefully, those things will be good things and things that move us away from doing harm, and also move us to a place where in relationship we can be a witness in other places. And those other places, folks in those other places can also be a witness to us, because our LGBTQ folks in some countries, some places within the US and some places outside of the US are fighting a courageous battle. They're fighting a courageous battle. So I hear you, and just to, be completely transparent, no, this will not solve this worldwide. Our hope is to create contextualization that will help us begin. In fact, I think the more we begin to deal with this within local contexts, within the context of relationship, I believe the better we are. It's one thing, even at the General Conference level, to deal with this sort of big picture, but it's different when it's in your own annual conference, when it's in your own local church, because whatever you may believe theologically, whatever your particular social positions may be, you're dealing with people that you're in relationship with. Our brother Henderson, Reverend Henderson, who started us out, talked about, do you see me? We don't see each other in the words of legislation or in the words of discipline. We see each other in relationship. So the greater degree to which we can become contextual and local in grappling with these kinds of questions, the more able we will be, I think, the more able we'll be to see each other, to grapple with this in relationship. And it's one thing to make it all abstract, make it an issue, but when you come face to face with someone who's hurting, that is what begins to transform the heart and the church and the world. So thank you for your question.
Others who would like to speak to that? Jay?
Do no harm, do good, attend upon the ordinances of God. Stay in love with God, as Bishop Joe expressed. The protocol and the UMNext plan actually, in reality, don't even meet up to the first general rule of doing no harm. It actually removes harmful language from the Book of Discipline, but it does not implement any protections that would prevent doing harm in quote-unquote regional context within the United States. In other words, it says we're going to remove the language from the discipline, but discrimination could continue to happen in context in the United States. So not only does it not fully do no harm, we still haven't moved into the second general rule of doing good.
Reverend Dotson.
Yeah, I'll just simply say there is no plan that is going to prevent harm from happening. It's deeper than that. And to even advocate any plan that would say, there will be no further harm, then there's no language in the discipline that speaks against racism. It still exists. Or sexism, that's still part of our reality. And so I would suggest to you that when we start talking about doing no harm, it's deeper. It's going to require a heart change from the people of God. And so my interest as a believer in Christ in signing on to this protocol is at least to create a church, an opportunity for a church to remove discriminatory and harmful and hurtful language, but also to create a church that can create safe spaces and can begin and continue the work of advocating and for justice for all of God's children. And so I simply lift that up to you to say that there is no perfect plan other than God's plan. And so I lift that up to you, to the delegates of General Conference, to say where we are right now is we're doing harm to one another, and that has to stop. We can stop that. And the second thing I would say to you, as we've talked about issues of disillusion or dissolving the church, disillusion comes with harm, right? So as I start thinking about this, I start thinking about this from a larger perspective and saying, at least I want to begin this process, and this is a process for us to, I believe, act in more just and holy ways.
Okay. Mr. Brewington.
All right. Joe Harris, Oklahoma
Joe Harris,
Conference. Clergy. I actually have 12 questions, but I only asked 3 because of time consideration. And this has to do with the protocol. And one of the questions that I have is, who is engaged in the writing of the legislation of the protocol? Is it possible to know who those persons are? When is that anticipated to be completed? The other question is, when it's presented, is it intended to be legislation as a whole or legislation that can be broken up into different legislative committees? And the final question is, if the protocol begins at the close of the General Conference 2020, for those annual conferences that meet immediately afterwards, and mine is one of those, would that have the opportunity for an annual conference, if it wanted to put it on the annual conference agenda and it reached to 20%, to then vote on choices, or even if it reached to 20%, could that be delayed to a special called conference, which might be later in the year? So you may not be able to answer all those questions, but whatever you can answer would be appreciated.
Thank you so very much. So there's a team, a small team of persons comprised of the mediation team that are actually writing the protocol. And all of us have been involved in this process. When we finished the press conference we did in Tampa, we spent the remainder of that day focusing on the legislation to enact the protocol. So it's a small team, and with some help from some other persons around the denomination as well. It will be completed very soon. So the goal is to have this out by the end of the month. I know that people are anxious to see the legislation, but it is being written and will be done by the end of the month and available for people to see. We do anticipate this protocol coming as a whole, yes. That would be our preferred way of presenting it. And your last question deals with annual conferences. And my answer is yes, they could act immediately following the close of General Conference. So annual conferences would have a year. So they could do that at that annual conference or a special called annual conference, or they could get it done by the following year. Yeah.
Question here, please.
Sally Haynes from Missouri, and my question is about the protocol also. I know that y'all talked about it being a process, not the results, but my question is that in the post-separation United Methodist Church, I see that you mention immediately repealing the traditionalist plan, but do you have plans or processes for a larger restructuring of the post-separation United Methodist Church?
So you're speaking to Article 6 of the protocol, and I think the intent is clearly outlined there. But I will tell you that we're trying to figure out together with some help from other persons as well who have written and shared some excellent suggestions on how we can achieve what we're trying to achieve at this General Conference. So that is our intent. And we're trying to figure out how to do that, and with the help from a whole lot of people who've given us excellent suggestions on how to make that happen. As we think about the future of the post-separation UMC, one of the things that we advocate for, when I say we, again, for persons who will be continuing, who will be a part of the post-separation UMC, United Methodist Church, the UMC Next, part of the UMC Next legislation is a call for the 21st Century Commission on 21st Century Church. I mean, we envision a group of young, diverse, innovators, entrepreneurs, a group of people who are giving and creating and thinking the best way. What does it mean for us to be the church in the 21st century? What does it mean for us to deliver ministry in the 21st century? What does it mean for us to be connectional in the 21st century? So know that we're going to go into an extreme, exciting, I believe, exciting period of reformation and dreaming and becoming a new church. You know, and so I'm excited about those possibilities that lie before us. So just know that will be an anticipated period of reformation that would happen post-separation.
Sam, if I could, yeah. Right, there's never any guarantees. None of the plans can guarantee that harm would not happen. But you try. You give your best effort to put into place protections that would prevent harm. One of the things, you know, we're a couple days after MLK Day, right, the letter from the Birmingham jail continues to be on my mind, where, you know, it's written from jail to a number of clergy, among which are two Methodist bishops. And it calls out gradualism and incrementalism, and calls us to do good, to do better, to reach, to stretch, to live into the gospel of liberation, the message that Jesus Christ preached. So although we cannot ensure that harm isn't done, it is a sad commentary of where we are in the church that the negotiated settlement can't actually reach to offer protections that protect the most marginalized and the most vulnerable. Last thing I just want to say on this part is, right, we knew that this panel would mostly be concerned around like the protocol, and it's a real question around like a real commentary we might offer around power and how it functions in our church today. We're all tired. We all want to be done with the fight. We're exhausted and we want to move forward. I get that. And I know that when I'm tired, I don't trust the decisions that I make. I need to go to sleep if I'm writing a paper, trying to do something important, needing to send an email. So we have to really be suspicious of trying to reach a settlement out of exhaustion, particularly when there's really the process of like arriving at the protocol, like questions the separation of powers that's at the heart of how we conference together. What I mean by that is you've got a process driven in large part by the Council of Bishops, that chose a select group of folks, made a decision, presented a protocol that was negotiated behind closed doors. It gets pumped out to the world because it goes out on the Council of Bishops letterhead to the media, and we hear about it on the front page of the Globe and the Times and the Post, and now a whole system, a whole process is using the institutional mechanism to prioritize that plan before the church, and saying, oh yeah, it's a plan like every other plan. Well, none of the other plans got a UMCOM press conference. I mean, the morning session was entirely 3 presentations for the protocol, right? To say, hey, this is our plan, but we actually want the protocol. So we have to be very suspicious of the way that like power actually is functioning, because if ends are predetermined in the means, well, then we actually have a pretty strong indication of what the post-separation United Methodist Church would be, because the protocol process actually intentionally excluded Forward, others that offered the simple plan, then says take the simple plan's language of removing harm, but we're actually not invited to the table to be representative, and oh yeah, there's no room for ethnic caucuses either. So we have to really just ask, the process that led us to a protocol, which everybody kind of desires to stop the fighting, actually might give us an indication of the enduring harm that will exist in a future post-separation United Methodist Church.
I'm feeling somebody will want to respond, so go ahead. Reverend Kenneth.
Great. I want to respond in a different way, because what I heard was, how do we deal with the matters that keep us from growth, that keep us from vitality, that have us in decline? And envisioning a U.S. regional conference also envisions a place to talk about contextual issues surrounding ministry. A place where we can think about how is our denomination structured, and is it structured in a way that really allows us to do ministry in the most effective ways. To think about how things happen within our annual conferences, to think about where decisions are made. The U.S. Regional Conference can also empower the annual conferences to make certain decisions around how things get organized in the annual conference, and how ministry might happen on the ground. So I just want to highlight that, and then I want to go one step farther than that. We talk a lot about structure, and we're here talking about, we're all delegates, but we're also leaders of the church. And ultimately, we are going to move forward when we all start behaving differently. When we all start taking that step, really to walk into risk, being courageous in our witness, being courageous in our risk-taking and our willingness to experiment and try different things. What we already know is what got us here. And so we're going to have to adapt and learn to move forward. So I just want to put a shout out for, it doesn't stop at General Conference, no matter what plan gets adopted. We are going to be challenged as a denomination to grow and to change into new realities that we can't really even imagine. I'm excited about that, but I'm also challenged by it.
I want to say a few things. Number one, when this group came together by way of invitation, I mean, I received an email from Bishop Yamasu asking me to come, would I be involved in a conversation. And he was inviting a group of persons across the theological spectrum. And so we show up in July, and I have to tell you, at this first meeting, we didn't think we were going to even continue post-July. And there, by the way, there were no U.S. bishops a part of the July meeting. So this was called by Bishop Yamasu and other Central Conference bishops. They initiated this conversation. We came together in a room, we talked. And at the conclusion of this meeting, the decision was, well, do you want to continue talking? And I have to tell you, the majority of the people in the room said, I think we're done. We're so divided, there's nothing we're ever going to agree on. And Bishop Yamasu invited us to continue. Prayerfully asked us if we would continue, perhaps with a smaller group of people. And we spent time talking about, is it even possible for us to come to any type of framework of agreement? What type of gift could we offer to the church? Those were the things that drove that conversation. We gathered together in August, a month later. It was a similar type of experience. And then the concept or the idea or the invitation The offer from Ken Feinberg arose. Then we talked about continuing this conversation mediated by Ken Feinberg. So this was kind of how this conversation began to morph and to unfold. But following General Conference in February, there were a ton of conversations happening across the denomination, across the connection. And I personally and other members of the team I know tried to be in as many of those conversations as we possibly could. And it wasn't for the purpose of we're going to develop a protocol. It was I wanted to be present. I wanted to listen to people. I wanted to hear great ideas. I wanted to add my voice and energy to helping to develop the future of this denomination. And when we started meeting together, and particularly when we started the mediation process, part of our covenant with each other was that we would continue to be in those type of conversations, and we were. Part of the covenant was that we would continue to have cascading conversations with as many people as we could, just to hear as many things as we could, and we did. And part of the covenant was we also had the benefit of legislation that had been submitted for consideration at General Conference, so we had the benefit of those ideas. And so what I'm sharing with you is that it would be a mistake to say that these were 16 people in a closed room, sometime behind closed doors, doing some kind of nefarious thing. It's just not true. And there were many persons who were involved in conversations and in listening, trying to get to a yes. And at the end of the day, it's a protocol that has to be enacted by you. You are the ultimate decision makers, and you are the persons who will make the ultimate decisions as it relates to the future of our denomination. Now, I stand before you as a person who is committed to the protocol. I stand before you as a person who served as an executive convener of UMC Next and committed to the 4 commitments of UMC Next. I stand before you as a person who deeply believes that this process, the result of the protocol, will give us the best chance as a denomination to move forward so that people can determine their best futures. That's the great thing, is that new denominations can emerge as a result of this, and persons can determine their best future.
See,
If you could make it quick, we want to get in a few more
Okay,
questions.
I just wanted to say that none of us up here were authorized to do what we're doing. We are all grassroots people who had a passion for the church, pain for what happened in St. Louis, got together with other groups of people on our own, paid our own expenses. No one funded this. I think for all of us, it was an individual effort to try to bring some resolution to the challenges we face. Now, I know that there's a lot of people who have responded, they don't want to see the church to split. I had a church historian give me an interesting observation on that. He said the Methodist Church has had probably about 20 splits since John Wesley. And one of the things they discovered is that in most of those splits, both sides grew afterwards. And why was that? Because they had a clear mission. When we had the splits with the holiness movement and those who didn't believe in smoking and drinking, going into movies, and they left the Methodist Church, Free Methodist and Wesleyan Methodist, they grew. The Methodist Church grew because you knew what you're getting when you went there. So I don't think that separating into 2 or 3 different groups is going to harm. In fact, it may help our mission to reach more people because we'll all be clear about who we're reaching. And when someone joins that church, they know what it's about. It's clarity of mission that helps people grow. It's conflict over mission that keeps growth from happening. And I think the conflict that we've had for 47 years has been one of the things that has held us back from making disciples of Jesus Christ.
Okay, here and then here, and let's be as concise as possible so more people can have a chance. Thanks.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Charlie Moore-Lay from Baltimore Washington Conference. I'd just like to thank you all for the opportunity to be here today to listen and also ask questions. So I have a question for Reverend Dotson. It's my understanding that as you all are currently developing the specific legislation, that you're not contemplating putting anything in the legislation that would recommend or identify where the $25 million would be coming from. My question is, would you all seriously reconsider that? Because my concern is that if we go to General Conference and we have this very detailed protocol to consider, and there's no identification of where the funds are coming from, that I think it seriously detract from the ability to get something passed. So I would ask you all to consider perhaps assembling a small group with a representative maybe from GCFA, Connectional Ministries, General Secretary's table, or possibly others, to take a look at this.
Okay, thank you. If you could explain about the 25 million.
Yes, so noted. So I hear your suggestion and know that there will be a group of persons working to present some possibilities, some funding possibilities that will include some of the entities that you just named as well. So
The 25 million would go to the departing group.
How we would actually fund it.
Right. Right. I just want to make sure everybody knew what we were talking about. Okay, here, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Reverend Andy Emmanuel. I am a clergy delegate from Southern Nigeria Annual Conference. My question is, upon all these plans that are coming, I want to ask how much of African voice and aspiration are represented. And in the Indy plan, you said all Central Conference will go with a traditional way. My question is, how did you arrive at that conclusion? And the last question, in the last General Conference, we put up committee to work on additional bishops in Africa. I have not heard anything in these plans regarding these 5 additional bishops. And my question is this plan a product of post-separation United Methodist or the new church that we're thinking about?
So who would like to take that on?
Was your question, how did we arrive at the conclusion that African or that Central Conferences would go traditional? Was part of the question? Well, in the Indianapolis plan, we looked at the fact that about 80% of the Central Conferences voted for the traditional plan in St. Louis. And so as we were dividing into centrist and traditional and progressive, well, probably they would choose that because 80% of them voted for the traditional plan. That was the logic. Now, that's different in the protocol. The protocol says that if the conferences and Central Conferences don't decide, they stay a part of the United Methodist Church. I don't have an argument with that. It was just a decision. In the United States, the estimate is probably 60 to 70% of the United Methodist churches in the United States tend to be centrists. So we said if they don't make a decision about where they're going, they become centrist. It was just made on what we thought the statistics are on where they would naturally line up anyway. So they wouldn't all have to vote. If they were centrist, they would just stay with the centrist United Methodist Church. The deeper question is, and I think all of us realize, we did not have adequate representation of Central Conferences in our groups. We didn't. And as I mentioned, we all were funding ourselves. We had no capacity to bring people from Central Conferences to our conversation. But what we did do was make our first draft, a draft that was not the final product. And we sent it all around, made it public. We probably got 20 or 30 emails from persons in Central Conferences about questions about it, suggestions. And we took those to our committee. Those were incorporated. Every draft we wrote was sent to Bishop Yambasu because we knew he was working with another group and said, what input do you have? So we were trying to seek input before we got to the final product, though we did not have Central Conference delegates around the table, and you're right at that.
Thank you. At the connectional table includes members from the U.S. and from each of the central conferences. And over the course of the 4 years, the full quadrennium, and actually before that, the connectional table has worked on this legislation for U.S. as a regional conference. We have included the voices of people from Europe, from Africa, and the Philippines. In addition, we have taken this legislation for discussion to multiple meetings of the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters and gotten input from that committee, which is heavily inclusive of people from the central conferences. The CT legislation in November was endorsed by the College of Central Conference Bishops. Our chair of the connectional table is a Central Conference bishop, and as you know, our incoming chair will be Bishop Mayumbo, again, a Central Conference bishop. So we have had Central Conference voices involved in this throughout. And I just want to say one real quick shout out, because I know we're getting to the end of our time. I want to thank the connectional table members who have worked on this. I know that a few of us are here, a few of my board members are here. Judy Kenniston led this group, this U.S. Contextual Ministries group, U.S. as a regional conference group. I know that Robin Scott is here. I know that Michelle Hetman is here. I know that others are present who have been involved in the leadership of putting this legislation together. As well, staff of the connectional table, myself included, we have been involved in multiple conversations around the connection, not just in the U.S., but also in the central conferences. I will be in Manila in mid-February at one of their annual conference meetings to, again, begin to discuss this. We are not just talking about the legislation, we're also listening. And listening with the intent of how the connectional table can be involved in multiple ways in moving us away from being such a U.S.-centric denomination to a denomination that really listens to all voices. Thank you.
We have about 50 seconds left. Alani?
I would say for UMC Next, we long for that authentic relationship with Central Conference delegates. I think one of the criticisms of St. Louis is that it was very difficult to have authentic conversation in the midst of all that struggle. And so I just want to say that there's a lot of delegates in the room who want that authentic relationship Dr. Betty was talking about, and I hope you'll reach out to us in UMC Next and begin to build those bridges and do that listening and begin to work in a coordinated way for the church that will endure beyond 2020.
And in the 12 seconds I have left, I will say that part of the uniqueness of the protocol was that it was initiated by Central Conference bishops, and they were in the room. Central Conference representatives were in the room and in conversation throughout the entire process. So I think that was the uniqueness and part of the strength of the protocol. It truly represents the best ideas from across our connection.
Sam, if I could just...
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's extend.
Forward is a collective of folks who are committed to centering the voices of the marginalized, persons of color, queer persons, trans folk from across the connection. It's an invitation to all who might be part of marginalized groups and those who want to stand in solidarity to join as we live into a liberation as expression of the Wesleyan heritage of grace and holiness.
We've had great questions. We have some more. I'm sorry we're going to have to wrap this up, but we'll continue this through conversations in the hall. Let's please thank our speakers today. I'm getting an appeal from the speakers to allow a question, so we'll go one more, and please, I know you'll be concise. Thank you.
How do the plans...
Oh,
can we at
go a
least
few more
ask the
minutes, or do
questions?
we cannot?
Can we at least ask the questions, even if they're not answered?
Okay, let's ask a question. Let's ask the questions, and we won't have answers. We'll get the questions on the table, and then we have to wrap up in fairness to the rest of the program. So, here, please.
Skylar Marston Beal, Pacific Northwest Conference lay delegate. I use they and she pronouns. And my question comes in recognition of Reverend Williams' comments about the power structures that have been at play within the context of this, and hoping to maybe leverage some of the power structures at play with a question regarding the protocol. Specifically, the protocol calls for an abeyance of complaints. However, it does not seem that there is any mechanism for enforcement of that, and I recognize we don't have a bishop on the stage at this time, so again, maybe no answer is possible regardless of time. But how will the Council of Bishops come to an agreement on the holding in abeyance of complaints when we saw in Virginia that the protocol's call to do just that is not being honored and therefore is not reassuring to all Methodists in every corner of the world? Thank you.
Let's just get the questions on the table. I'm afraid that's the best we can do. You were here first.
Jessica Vittorio, North Texas Conference. I've heard all of y'all at some point speak about the new variation of the church, whatever it may be, incorporating young leadership. And so I have, two questions that hopefully you'll think about. One is, I'd like to hear two numbers: the number of people that were on your core decision-making team when you created these, and the number of those individuals that were under the age of 40. And I am not including people that you consulted or whose voices you heard. I want to know how many of those people actually sitting at the table with decision-making power were under the age of 40. And secondarily, I want to know, if you do intend to incorporate young leadership in the new church, what portions of your plan actually provide procedural protections and incorporation of those voices?
Thank you for that. Last question.
Several have talked about the impact of mission and the possibility of increasing that impact. So my question is, how does your plan empower the church to increase its missional impact with the poor and marginalized around the world?
Thank you for those questions. And one more time, let's thank our speakers.